had his China policy, and then the U.S. kind of had a response to what they believed were aggressive moves by China in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Basically, Taiwan took itself off the table in 2008 to 2012, and China started to pick on every other neighbor. And so the U.S. got the U.S. attention, it got the neighbors' attention, and so the policy, at least, is to resist and push back and demonstrate that we are still very committed to the region and will be the leader in the region and will reassure our allies and deter China from provocative actions. Anyway, that's kind of that's where the U.S. is, that's where Taiwan is. The PRC, I think, under Hu Jintao, in terms of its Taiwan policy, I think they could not have been happier that Ma Ying-jeou was elected initially, and so they were willing to not abate their military buildup and not keep the pressure on sort of latently, but were willing to back off on some other issues with respect to Taiwan. Xi Jingping just seems like a much tougher guy, a centralizer and in terms of centralizing his and a guy who's just not to be trifled with on the international stage. So I don't know that he has the same kind of, let's call it a softer approach by Hu Jintao. This is all relative, but I don't know that he has the same, patience with respect to Taiwan issues that Hu Jintao developed over the course of his term. So that's kind of in a nutshell where we stand today. But the quick sort of how did we get here? For me the issue is is what happened is that Taiwan as a sort of matter of survival and grand strategy in the late 1980s, maybe even starting before that, after the U.S. went through this very convoluted set of policies that first almost entirely abandoned Taiwan in the 1970s, which culminated in a very messy pulling of forces out of Taiwan, abrogating the U.S.-Taiwan Defense Treaty, and then de-recognizing Taiwan, as a state, and so on, to kind of a revolt in Congress and the Taiwan Relations Act being passed, closest as you'll get to a legislated treaty. It's not a treaty, but the closest thing you'll get, for those of you interested in executive legislative power, the closest thing you'll get that I could think of in U.S. Recent history of a Congress basically telling the executive branch in 1979, no way, we're not abandoning Taiwan like this, and we're passing this treaty and forcing your hand on many issues, which then resulted in a de facto embassy, even though we call it a cultural center or an institute, de facto diplomatic relations, de facto cultural relations, de facto security relations. But still, it was such a shock that Chiang Ching-Kuo at the time knew very well that he needed to do something to retain U.S. support. I mean, this had been a Cold War alliance until that time, and the way it was handled by President Nixon, the things that are now coming out about Henry Kissinger and just the way he handled, it was just, no way to treat an old friend. Let's put it that way. And not being honest with the Congress of the people and so on. Just a shock to Taiwan. Not only a shock to Taiwan, it was famously the Nixon shock, so it shocked everyone in Asia as well, Japan and others. And then Jimmy Carter building on that and so on. So Taiwan was in shock. So I view Taiwan's democratization as part of this grand strategy for survival. The only way they were going to build enduring, now that the Cold War alliance had ended, and the always fanciful notion that the ROC was the sole legitimate representative of China and Taiwan, the idea that the Taiwanese military was arrayed to reinvade the mainland and take it over, all those notions were kind of disappearing over the course of decades before. But I think now no more. The Cold War was no longer a reason for the U.S. and Taiwan to have a relationship since the U.S. moved to this normalization with China, and therefore, and therefore a Cold War strategy to put.
Can I interrupt you for a minute? If you guys come around this way, there are seats over here, and it'll be easier than you're trying to climb over all these people.
Is that the one?
Sorry.
That's okay. Now I have to start over again. I had it in my mind now. Anyway, so grand strategy for survival. The Taiwan, there's so much sort of bad news in foreign and policy and so on, but Taiwan was a very, very good news story, as was the U.S. in the sense that, the resurgence in the 1980s of U.S. confidence and power that not only put pressure on adversaries, but pressured allies to democratize. So I think the U.S. had a hand, certainly, in pressing Marcos to step down the South Korea transition, and then the pressure the Congress and others put on Chiang Ching-Kuo because of his overreaching on human rights. So this was the beginning age of democracy, in the 1980s, 1990s. Larry Diamond here, who's the world's greatest expert, so I'm not going to rehash that. But the point being that Taiwan saw what was going on, and other countries saw the types of support the U.S. was giving to those countries, and had a very top-down approach. It had two phases of its democratization. Chiang Ching-Kuo himself decided that this was the way he was going to go, and he set up a number of working groups on each set of democratization issues and each set of rule of law issues, and had people working on that. The DPP, of course, the Democratic Progressive Party, was working hard as activists to set up their own opposition, civil society, kind of the standard development that you often hear about in terms of the way it's supposed to work in democratization: middle class, more wealth, more participation, and so on. So Taiwan became a democracy, and it was a very proud moment, as it should have been. Also an economic powerhouse. The two kind of coincided. Became important to the democratic world now for different reasons. Not on the fiction that it was the sole representative of all of China, but the fact that it was a Chinese democracy, or a Chinese cultural democracy, which at first of its kind in a long time. And I think that that's kind of where the problems began with the PRC in terms of this next phase of ROC-PRC competition, because what happened? Well, there were a lot of the so-called native Taiwanese who, had been, coming to the island for hundreds of years before those KMT officials who had fled the mainland in 1949, who now had a say in politics, and essentially their say was, guess what? We've never been part of China, and we never were really okay with this policy the KMT had of retaking the mainland. And essentially, if you look at it in the sweep of history, Taiwan declared that they were no longer party to a civil war that the PRC was, that the PRC was a party to. So if you look at it in the sweep of history, one side said, okay, we're done, enough, we have no designs on you. In fact, our laws are going to change. We no longer have unification as our policy. We no longer have any of that. And the PRC, was kind of caught flat-footed. I mean, our part of our reason for being was, to get Taiwan back and to end the Civil War altogether. And this is missed very often. But here's an example of democracy and what should have been much more peaceful and stable relations, because one side doesn't want to fight about it anymore. But the PRC didn't really know what to do with all that. And if you really trace, they're trying to get a handle on what was going on in Taiwan, and it's kind of like, we've been fighting for so long, and now they're not fighting anymore. So, what now? I mean, for those of you who have kids, I certainly experienced it with my own, when they forget what they're fighting about, and then one stops, and they're all confused. So you look at the 1990s, and you see confusion in Chinese policy. Li Dongwei is elected. He was part of the well, he wasn't elected until later, but he took over for Chiang Ching-Kuo after he died. He was part of the democracy movement. He was a native Taiwanese, spoke Japanese, in fact, better than he speaks Mandarin. Brother is buried at Yakusuni Shrine in Japan. It's a different generation of or I guess not buried. I guess the right terminology would be memorialized. Yeah. So a different generation of Taiwanese altogether. Who, by the way, the Japanese orientation. It's the one place I can find in Asia where they actually look upon the Japanese occupation as better than what happened afterwards. So Japanese orientation was very important in terms of the way Taiwan was looking at the world. But the PRC just started to change its policy of vilifying the KMT for its designs on the mainland, and began to vilify this guy Li Deng for his not having designs on the mainland. I mean, a very odd turn of affairs in international politics, if there ever was one. And he was still working within KMT parameters of